Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is the Civil War's strangest survival. Foods you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Civil War's strangest survival. Foods. If you have settled into a comfortable place, perhaps beneath a warm blanket as the evening grows quiet, allow yourself to drift gently into another time. Imagine that the bright lights of the modern world slowly fade away. The distant sound of traffic disappears, replaced by the soft whisper of wind moving through tall oak trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls into the gathering darkness, while the faint crackle of a campfire rises into the cool night air. Tonight, our journey takes us back more than a century and a half into one of the most difficult chapters of American history. The Civil War is often remembered through stories of famous battles, determined generals, and enormous armies marching across fields that would soon become part of history. Yet behind every battlefield stood thousands upon thousands of ordinary people whose greatest struggle was often far simpler than victory or defeat. They needed something to eat. For soldiers, farmers, nurses, children, and families scattered across towns and lonely countryside, finding enough food slowly became one of the greatest challenges of everyday life. Long before shortages became official policy, people noticed little changes. Shelves emptied more quickly than usual. Wagons carrying supplies arrived late or sometimes never arrived at all. Familiar meals gradually became rare memories. The war transformed kitchens just as surely as it transformed battlefields. Imagine opening a wooden cupboard and finding only a handful of coarse cornmeal, a few dried beans, and perhaps a small piece of salt pork that had to feed an entire family for several days. Every crumb suddenly mattered. Every vegetable growing in a garden became valuable. Nothing could be wasted. As the seasons changed, people discovered remarkable ways to survive. Some of the foods they eventually relied upon would seem almost unbelievable today. Others had been known for generations, but suddenly became essential once again. Some were born entirely from necessity, created because there simply was no other choice. What makes these survival foods so fascinating is not merely how unusual they appear to modern eyes. Instead, they reveal something much deeper about human resilience. Throughout history, whenever ordinary comforts disappeared, people adapted with astonishing creativity. The Civil War offers countless examples of this quiet determination. During peaceful times, bread often arrived fresh from local bakeries or was baked daily at home using reliable supplies of wheat flour. Coffee was an everyday comfort that helped begin the morning. Sugar sweetened desserts and preserved fruit. Butter added richness to nearly every meal. War slowly stripped away these familiar pleasures. Railroads that once carried food now carried troops and ammunition. Rivers became dangerous routes. Farms lost workers as young men left for military service. Harvests were interrupted, livestock disappeared. Entire communities found themselves depending upon whatever could still be grown, gathered, traded, or preserved. Even before true hunger appeared, uncertainty settled into daily life. Nobody knew whether tomorrow's meal would resemble today's. A simple breakfast became something to appreciate rather than to expect. Every successful harvest felt like a small victory. For soldiers marching hundreds of miles, food carried an entirely different meaning. It was not simply nourishment. It represented energy, hope, and sometimes even home itself. Letters written during the war often spoke about food almost as frequently as they described battles. Soldiers dreamed about warm biscuits, fresh milk, roasted chicken, ripe apples, and pies cooling upon familiar windowsills. These memories became comforting companions during long nights spent beside smoky campfires. Reality, however, rarely matched those comforting dreams. Army rations were designed for practicality rather than pleasure. Hard bread that could survive months of travel became common. Salted meat endured long journeys without refrigeration, but often arrived tough, dry, or heavily salted. Beans appeared again and again. Coffee, whenever available, became one of the most treasured comforts a soldier could receive. Yet even these supplies sometimes disappeared. When supply wagons failed to arrive, soldiers learned to depend upon whatever the surrounding countryside could provide. Wild berries, edible greens, fish from nearby streams, and occasionally unfamiliar plants all found their way into cooking pots. Many of these improvised meals would never have appeared in peacetime. Families faced similar challenges. In cities throughout both the North and the South, shortages gradually encouraged remarkable creativity inside ordinary kitchens. Housewives developed recipes that replaced missing ingredients with whatever remained available. Children learned that familiar treats might disappear for months or even years. Coffee, one of the greatest daily comforts of the 19th century, became especially difficult to obtain in many southern communities as blockades tightened around Confederate ports. People refused to abandon their morning tradition. Instead, they searched fields and forests for substitutes. Roasted chicory roots produced a dark drink with a pleasantly bitter flavor. Roasted acorns, carefully prepared to remove their bitterness, sometimes became another alternative. Sweet potatoes were sliced, dried, roasted, and ground into powders that resembled coffee more in appearance than in taste. None truly replaced coffee. Yet each warm cup offered something almost as valuable. Normality. Imagine sitting beside a small fireplace before sunrise. Outside, uncertainty hangs over the land. News from distant battlefields travels slowly. Loved ones may be hundreds of miles away. Yet inside a humble kitchen, someone carefully pours hot water over roasted roots, creating a familiar aroma that briefly makes the world feel ordinary once again. Sometimes survival depends not only upon calories, but upon comfort. Throughout history, familiar rituals have helped people endure extraordinary hardship. The Civil War reminds us that food carries emotional meaning as well as physical nourishment. A shared meal could strengthen hope. A treasured family recipe preserved memories. Even the smallest luxury, a spoonful of jam or a warm biscuit, could remind someone that peace might one day return. As the months turned into years, these improvised foods gradually became woven into everyday life. Children who had once expected abundant tables grew accustomed to simpler meals. Gardens expanded. Foraging became more common. Preservation techniques once practiced by grandparents suddenly returned to daily importance. Nothing useful was ignored. Vegetables were dried. Fruit was preserved whenever possible. Bones became broth. Animal fat became cooking seeds were carefully saved for future planting. Every successful harvest promised another season of survival. Looking back today, it is easy to admire the great battles and famous commanders whose names fill history books. Yet perhaps the quieter victories deserve equal attention. The mother who somehow prepared supper, despite nearly empty cupboards. The farmer who protected enough seed for next year's crop. The child who gathered wild berries to help feed younger brothers and sisters. History is often shaped by such ordinary courage. And nowhere does that courage become more visible than around the dinner table during difficult times. Tonight, as our journey continues, we will discover the remarkable stories behind some of the Civil War's strangest survival foods. Meals born not from luxury or fashion, but from determination, resourcefulness, and the quiet refusal to give up, even when every familiar comfort seemed to disappear. The first of those surprising foods began with something most people would never have imagined drinking in place of coffee. Yet, for countless families, it became one of the small rituals that helped them greet another uncertain morning. The surprising Civil War. Drinks that kept hope alive. Morning arrived quietly across the American countryside, long before the first rays of sunlight reached the tops of the trees. A cool mist often rested over open fields, while distant birds slowly welcomed another day. In peaceful years, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee might have drifted through homes, military camps, and busy town streets. It was a familiar scent that promised warmth, routine, and a small measure of comfort before the day's work began. But during the Civil War, especially in the Confederate South, that familiar smell gradually disappeared. Coffee was more than a beverage in the 19th century. For many people, it was a daily ritual that marked the beginning of the morning. Soldiers depended upon it to stay awake after long nights on picket duty. Farmers appreciated its warmth before heading into fields. Families gathered around steaming cups while discussing news that had traveled from neighboring towns or distant battlefields. As the Union blockade tightened along southern ports, imported coffee beans became increasingly rare. Before the war, much of America's coffee had arrived by ship from places such as Brazil and the Caribbean. Merchant vessels crossed the oceans carrying valuable cargo that eventually found its way into grocery stores across the country. The blockade changed everything. Ships carrying coffee struggled to reach southern ports. Those that succeeded did so only at great risk. As supplies diminished, prices climbed to astonishing heights. A luxury that had once been affordable slowly became something only a fortunate few could obtain. Imagine walking into a small general store sometime in 1863. The shelves are far emptier than they once were. Barrels that previously held coffee beans now stand nearly empty. The shopkeeper apologizes with a tired smile. He wishes he had better news, but another shipment has not arrived. Perhaps it never will. Customers leave carrying whatever substitutes they can find. At first, many hoped the shortages would only last a few weeks. Then weeks became months, and months stretched into years. Eventually, people stopped waiting for coffee to return, and instead they began searching for replacements. Nature itself became their pantry. One of the most successful substitutes came from a plant that had quietly grown beside roads and fields for generations: chicory. With its bright blue flowers opening beneath the summer sun, chicory hardly appeared remarkable. Most travelers probably walked past it without giving it much thought. Yet beneath the soil lay a thick root that possessed an unexpected quality. When cleaned, sliced, dried, and carefully roasted, the root developed a rich, dark color and a pleasantly roasted aroma. Once ground into small pieces and steeped in hot water, produced a drink surprisingly similar in appearance to coffee. Flavor was not identical. Coffee possesses oils and aromas that are difficult to imitate. Chicory carried an earthier taste with gentle bitterness and subtle sweetness. Yet after months without genuine coffee, many people welcomed the comforting warmth of a steaming cup. Some families mixed the last precious handfuls of real coffee with roasted chicory to make their supplies last longer. Each passing week contained a little less coffee and a little more chicory, until eventually only the substitute remained. Still, morning routines continued. Perhaps that mattered most. Human beings often find strength in familiar habits. During uncertain times, repeating ordinary routines can provide surprising comfort. Brewing a warm drink before sunrise reminded people that despite war, life continued. Another substitute required even greater patience. Across forests filled with towering oaks, countless acorns covered the ground every autumn. Children often gathered baskets full of them while helping parents prepare for winter. Most people today would never consider drinking acorns. Fresh acorns contain tannins that make them extremely bitter. Eating them without preparation would be unpleasant. Civil War families knew how to solve this problem. The acorns were shelled and crushed into smaller pieces. They were then soaked repeatedly in fresh water, allowing the bitter tannins to wash away. This process sometimes took several days. Only after careful preparation could the acorns be dried and roasted. Once roasted, they were ground into coarse powder and brewed much like coffee. The result offered a warm, nutty drink with gentle, earthy flavors. It lacked caffeine entirely, but it filled empty cups with something comforting. Sometimes comfort matters just as much as stimulation. Other families experimented with sweet potatoes. This may seem surprising at first. Sweet potatoes were already an important food crop throughout much of the South. They stored well, grew in difficult conditions, and produced dependable harvests, even when other crops failed. Someone eventually discovered that sliced sweet potatoes could be dried until nearly all moisture disappeared. After roasting, the slices darkened dramatically. Ground into powder, they created yet another coffee substitute. Its flavor leaned towards sweetness rather than bitterness, producing something entirely different from true coffee. Yet once again, people adapted. They learned not to compare these drinks with what they had lost. Instead, they appreciated what remained. Even grains entered the search for substitutes. Roasted barley, roasted rye, burnt corn, each produced its own distinct flavor. Every family developed favorite recipes through quiet experimentation. Imagine a grandmother standing beside a cast iron stove. She slowly stirs sliced chicory roots inside a heavy pan, watching them change from pale cream to golden brown, and finally to deep chestnut. The room fills with rich, roasted aromas. Nearby, grandchildren watch with curiosity. They may never have tasted genuine coffee. To them, this is simply how mornings begin. War has quietly reshaped their expectations. These substitute drinks soon acquired stories of their own. Visitors exchanged recipes. Neighbors traded roasting techniques. Some insisted longer roasting improved flavor. Others believed gentle roasting preserved sweetness. Small discoveries spread from kitchen to kitchen without newspapers or official instruction. Necessity became the greatest teacher. Meanwhile, Union soldiers generally enjoyed better access to imported coffee, although shortages occasionally affected them as well. Coffee became one of the most treasured items included in military rations. Letters written by Union soldiers often praised coffee with remarkable enthusiasm. After exhausting marches through mud, rain, or snow, simply boiling water over a campfire and preparing a hot cup transformed morale. Veterans later recalled coffee almost as vividly as they remembered back. One soldier described the comforting sound of coffee beginning to boil before sunrise. Another remembered sharing his last handful of beans with exhausted comrades after several difficult days. These moments remind us that food and drink create emotional memories alongside physical nourishment. The smallest comforts often shine brightest during hardship. Confederate soldiers faced far greater difficulties obtaining coffee. Many received substitute drinks instead. Some joked about them in letters home, others accepted them without complaint. Humor itself became another survival tool. Imagine several soldiers sitting around a small fire beneath towering pine trees. Tin cups rest in their hands. One man laughs that today's coffee probably began life as roasted peas. Another insists it tastes more like burnt fence posts. Laughter spreads through the group. For a few precious moments, hunger and homesickness fade into the background. The drink itself may not have been remarkable. The companionship certainly was. Some substitutes grew so common that they remained popular long after the war ended. Chicory coffee, especially in parts of the American South, continued appearing in homes for generations. Even today, some people enjoy coffee blended with roasted chicory, appreciating its distinctive flavor and its deep historical roots. What began as necessity eventually became tradition. History often works this way. Difficult times leave quiet gifts behind. Recipes developed during hardship sometimes survive because they carry memories of resilience rather than scarcity. Every unusual beverage tells a story far larger than its ingredients. It tells us about people refusing to surrender ordinary routines. It tells us about families protecting hope one morning at a time. It tells us that survival depends not only upon filling empty stomachs, but also upon preserving familiar rhythms that remind us life will continue. As another peaceful evening settles around us, imagine one final cup resting beside a small Civil War fireplace. The mug contains no imported coffee. There are no fragrant beans from distant plantations across the ocean. Instead, roasted roots gathered from nearby fields gently steam in the quiet kitchen. Outside, uncertainty still hangs over the nation. Inside, warmth remains. Sometimes that was enough. And while warm drinks comforted countless families, another surprisingly humble food became even more important. It was dry, remarkably hard, and often the subject of endless complaints from soldiers. Yet without it, thousands might never have survived the long marches and uncertain days of the Civil War. The nearly indestructible bread that fed an army. As another quiet morning slowly unfolds, imagine yourself standing beside a long line of canvas tents. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows from a distant farmhouse that has somehow escaped the destruction of war. Soldiers begin to stir, rubbing tired eyes after another night spent beneath rough wool blankets. Breakfast is about to begin. No one expects a feast. There will be no fluffy biscuits fresh from the oven, no warm loaves with butter melting into soft slices, and no sweet pastries waiting on the table. Those comforts belong to memories of home. Instead, each soldier reaches into his haversack and pulls out something that looks almost too simple to be called food. It is square, it is pale brown. It feels as hard as a piece of wood. This is hardtack. Among all the unusual foods of the Civil War, few became as famous or as infamous as this humble cracker. Millions upon millions of pieces were baked during the war, making hardtack one of the most common foods eaten by Union soldiers. It traveled hundreds of miles in wagons, on trains, and aboard riverboats, surviving conditions that would have ruined ordinary bread within days. Its greatest strength was also the reason so many soldiers complained about it. It almost never spoiled. Fresh bread is wonderfully soft because it contains moisture. That same moisture, however, allows mold to grow. In warm weather, a loaf might last only a few days before becoming inedible. Hardtack solved that problem in the simplest way imaginable. Nearly all the moisture was baked out. What remained was a biscuit so dry that bacteria and mold found little opportunity to survive. Properly stored, it could remain edible for months, and sometimes even years. The recipe itself was astonishingly simple: flour, water, a little salt, nothing more. No yeast was added to make it rise. No milk enriched the dough. No butter softened its texture. Once mixed together, the dough was rolled flat, cut into neat squares and pierced with rows of small holes before being baked slowly until it became rock hard. Those tiny holes served an important purpose. They allowed steam to escape during baking, helping each cracker dry evenly and reducing the chance of trapped moisture. The result was practical rather than delicious. Imagine holding one in your hand. It feels surprisingly heavy for its size. Knocking it against a table produces a sharp sound, almost like tapping two small stones together. Trying to bite into it immediately might leave your jaw aching. Many soldiers quickly learned that using their teeth alone was not the best idea. Some joked that hardtack was strong enough to stop a bullet. Others claimed it could survive longer than the soldiers themselves. The joke spread through camp because humor made difficult realities easier to endure. There was another reason soldiers often inspected each cracker carefully before eating. Tiny insects sometimes found their way inside during long months of storage. These small weevils became such familiar companions that soldiers invented amusing names for them. Some simply tapped the cracker against a rock or the butt of a rifle, hoping the insects would crawl out before breakfast. One veteran later remarked that if the weevils stayed inside, they simply became an unexpected source of protein. It was a practical attitude born from necessity. Waste was a luxury few could afford. Eating hardtack required creativity. Many soldiers soaked it in coffee until it softened enough to chew. Others crumbled it into soups or stews, allowing hot liquid to break it apart. Some fried pieces in baking grease, creating a meal that was far more enjoyable than eating it plain. Around countless campfires, soldiers developed their own favorite methods. One man preferred dipping it into hot coffee for several minutes. Another believed frying it with salt pork made it almost taste like home. A third crushed it into crumbs and mixed it with whatever vegetables could be found nearby. Every small improvement mattered. Picture a group of soldiers seated around a glowing fire as dawn slowly brightens the eastern sky. Tin cups filled with hot chicory or coffee warm their hands. One soldier carefully lowers a square of hardtack into his cup. The cracker slowly absorbs the steaming liquid. He waits patiently. Only after several minutes does he lift it out, now soft enough to bite without risking a broken tooth. It is not a luxurious breakfast, but it is breakfast. That alone brings quiet satisfaction. Hardtack represented something larger than food. It represented reliability. Military supply officers needed provisions that could travel hundreds of miles over rough roads without spoiling. Wagons bounced through mud. Trains shook across uneven tracks. Riverboats faced changing weather. Fresh bread simply could not survive such journeys. Hardtack could. Its toughness made it one of the most dependable foods of the entire war. Factories in the North worked tirelessly to produce enormous quantities. Bakers mixed huge batches of dough, rolled them into long sheets, cut thousands of squares, and stacked them into barrels for shipment. Each barrel became a promise. Wherever soldiers marched, food would hopefully follow. Of course, promises did not always become reality. Supply lines stretched across vast distances. Flooded rivers delayed wagons. Railroads were damaged. Bridges collapsed. Enemy raids interrupted deliveries. When fresh meat and vegetables disappeared, hardtack often remained. Sometimes it was all that remained. For many soldiers, that simple cracker became the difference between continuing the march and going hungry. Not every soldier hated it. Letters sent home occasionally mentioned hardtack without complaint. Hunger has a remarkable way of changing expectations. After walking 20 miles beneath the summer sun, carrying heavy equipment across uneven ground, even the plainest food could seem deeply satisfying. Modern readers sometimes smile at stories of soldiers grumbling about hardtack, but those complaints reveal something very human. People have always found ways to laugh together during hardship. The jokes were rarely signs of true bitterness. Instead, they strengthened friendships. Shared complaints created shared memories. Imagine an evening after a long day of marching. The fire burns low. Someone taps a piece of hardtack against a tree trunk. Another soldier laughs and claims the tree looks damaged. Soon, everyone is smiling. For a few moments, aching feet and homesickness fade into the background. Food has always carried stories alongside nourishment. Hardtack collected countless stories. Some soldiers carved their initials into unused crackers while waiting for orders. Others kept one in their pocket as a conversation piece. Years after the war ended, veterans often displayed pieces of hardtack during reunions, amazed that they had survived decades without changing very much at all. Few foods in history have demonstrated such extraordinary durability. Outside the military camps, civilians also baked versions of hard biscuits when flour needed to last longer. Families understood that ordinary bread spoiled quickly, especially during hot summers. Baking harder, drier biscuits sometimes helped stretch precious supplies. Nothing could be wasted. Flour itself had become too valuable. Every handful represented countless hours of labor in distant fields. Every biscuit represented careful planning. As peaceful evening settles once again across our imagined journey, it becomes easier to appreciate hardtack for what it truly was. Not a culinary masterpiece, not a favorite meal, but a quiet companion that traveled beside millions of weary footsteps. It asked for very little, only flour, water, salt, time, In return, it offered something priceless during uncertain years: dependability. And while soldiers often joked about chewing the hardest bread they had ever seen, another survival food demanded even greater patience. It came from barrels instead of ovens, tasted intensely salty, and required careful preparation before anyone could enjoy it. Yet for thousands of hungry families and marching armies, it became one of the most important foods of the entire Civil War, the barrel of meat that kept armies alive. The first light of morning arrives gently, painting the distant hills with soft shades of gold. Dew rests quietly upon tall grass while a cool breeze moves through the trees with barely a whisper. Somewhere beyond the camp, a horse stamps its hoof against the ground, eager for another day of travel. A small fire crackles back to life as weary hands begin preparing breakfast. The smell that slowly rises into the air is not fresh bread. It is not roasting chicken or sizzling bacon. Instead, it carries the unmistakable scent of heavily salted meat. For countless soldiers during the Civil War, this aroma meant another meal centered around one of the most dependable foods ever carried into battle: salt pork. Today, refrigerators quietly preserve meat for days or even weeks. Freezers allow food to remain safe for months. It is easy to forget how revolutionary such conveniences truly are. In the 19th century, none of those comforts existed. Once an animal had been slaughtered, time immediately became the enemy. Warm temperatures encouraged spoilage. Bacteria multiplied quickly. Unless the meat could be eaten, smoked, dried, or preserved, it would soon become unsafe. For generations, one simple mineral had solved this problem: salt. Salt was far more than a seasoning. It was one of history's greatest tools for survival. By drawing moisture from meat, it created an environment where harmful microorganisms struggled to grow. Long before electricity or refrigeration, people across the world relied upon salt to preserve precious food. The Civil War depended heavily upon this ancient knowledge. Imagine a farm late in autumn. The harvest has been gathered. Cooler weather has finally arrived, making it the perfect season for preserving meat. Families know that winter lies ahead, and every piece of food must be carefully prepared. After butchering a hog, large cuts of pork are rubbed generously with coarse salt. Nothing is left uncovered. The salt works slowly, drawing moisture from deep within the meat. Then the pieces are packed tightly into large wooden barrels. More salt fills every empty space. Sometimes a strong saltwater brine is added as well. The barrel is sealed. Inside, the pork begins a transformation that will allow it to survive for months without refrigeration. These barrels soon became familiar sights throughout military supply depots. Loaded onto wagons, stacked aboard steamboats, and carried by rail, they followed the armies wherever they marched. Each heavy barrel represented thousands of future meals. Without preserved meat, feeding enormous armies would have been nearly impossible. Fresh livestock could not always travel alongside marching soldiers. Hunting rarely provided enough food for entire regiments. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles. Salt pork solved many of those problems. It could endure long journeys. It resisted spoilage. It provided valuable calories and fat. Yet it came with one significant challenge. It was incredibly salty. Imagine opening one of those barrels after several weeks. The smell is strong but reassuring. The pork has survived. A cook reaches inside and removes a thick piece glistening with salt crystals. No one plans to eat it immediately. That would be nearly impossible. Instead, the meat is soaked in water for hours, sometimes overnight. The water slowly draws out some of the excess salt. Even after soaking, much of the salt remains. The meat is then boiled. Sometimes it is boiled more than once. Only then does it become suitable for cooking. The result is still much saltier than most modern tastes would expect. But for hungry soldiers, it offered something precious: protein, fat, strength. Fat in particular played a vital role. Long marches demanded enormous amounts of energy. Soldiers often walked 15 or 20 miles in a single day while carrying rifles, ammunition, blankets, cooking equipment, and personal belongings. Such effort burned countless calories. The rich fat found in salt pork helped replace some of that energy. It also served another important purpose. As the pork cooked, fat slowly melted into the pan. Nothing was wasted. Cooks saved every drop. That rendered fat became valuable cooking grease for frying vegetables, softening hardtack, or adding flavor to otherwise plain meals. A single piece of salt pork often contributed to several different dishes. Around campfires, soldiers became surprisingly inventive. Some diced the pork into beans, others mixed small pieces into cornmeal mush. A few carefully fried thin slices until the edges became crisp. The familiar sound of sizzling meat offered comfort that reached beyond hunger. Imagine sitting beside one of those campfires. The sun has not yet climbed above the horizon. Several tin kettles hang over glowing coals. One contains coffee, another holds beans. In a black iron skillet, pieces of salt pork slowly begin to brown. The gentle crackling sound mixes with quiet conversation. Someone tells a story from home, another writes a letter that may take weeks to arrive. For a little while, the camp feels less like an army and more like a neighborhood sharing breakfast together. These peaceful moments became treasured memories. Many veterans later remembered conversations around cooking fires more clearly than they remembered individual meals. Food creates companionship, even simple food. Of course, not everyone admired salt pork. Letters written by soldiers sometimes describe receiving the same meal day after day. Beans and salt pork, hardtack and salt pork, cornmeal and salt pork. The repetition could become exhausting. Yet complaints rarely change reality. Supplies were limited. Cooks prepared whatever was available. Sometimes fresh vegetables appeared when nearby farms or markets could provide them. Sometimes they did not. During long campaigns, salt pork remained dependable when little else could. Confederate soldiers often faced even greater shortages. As the war continued, preserving enough meat became increasingly difficult. Salt itself grew scarce in many southern regions. Without sufficient salt, preserving pork became far more challenging. Entire communities searched desperately for new salt supplies. Salt works expanded production. People evaporated seawater along the coast whenever possible. Others gathered naturally salty water from inland springs. Newspapers occasionally referred to salt as white gold. The nickname was well-deserved. Without salt, preserving food became dramatically more difficult. A shortage of salt threatened not only military supplies but also civilian survival. Imagine being a farmer who has successfully raised pigs throughout the year. Winter approaches. You have meat that could feed your family for months. But there is almost no salt available. Suddenly, preserving that meat becomes uncertain. Every day matters. Every pound of salt becomes precious. Such quiet struggles unfolded far from famous battlefields. History often remembers generals. It less often remembers the families searching desperately for enough salt to protect the winter's food. Yet their efforts were equally essential to survival. Salt pork also found its way into hospital kitchens. Doctors and nurses caring for wounded soldiers needed dependable sources of nourishment. Although fresh foods were always preferred whenever available, preserved meat often filled the gaps created by interrupted supply lines. Simple broths flavored with salt pork sometimes became gentle meals for recovering patients. Even small amounts added richness to soups made from beans or vegetables. Again, nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled, fat was saved. Every useful piece found another purpose. The Civil War repeatedly demonstrated a simple truth. Resourcefulness often matters more than abundance. People learned to stretch every ingredient farther than they had ever imagined possible. Modern kitchens offer incredible convenience. A visit to the grocery store provides choices that 19th century families could scarcely imagine. Fresh meat rests safely behind refrigerated glass. If something runs out, another shipment usually arrives within days. During the Civil War, no such certainty existed. Each preserved barrel represented security, not luxury. Security. As evening slowly settles once more across our quiet journey, picture one final barrel resting beneath the shelter of a supply wagon. Its wooden staves are stained by years of travel. Iron hoops hold everything tightly together. Inside rests enough preserved pork to sustain weary soldiers through another week of marching. It is not elegant. It is not exciting. But it quietly keeps hope alive. And while salt pork filled countless cooking pots across the divided nation, another surprisingly simple crop became just as important. Growing beneath the soil, easy to store, and remarkably filling. It helped families survive when flour, meat, and other familiar foods became increasingly difficult to find. The humble root that helped a nation endure. The day begins with gentle sunlight spreading across quiet fields. A light breeze stirs the leaves of tall oak trees, and somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic sound of a wooden wagon echoes along a dusty country road. The world seems peaceful for a brief moment, almost allowing hardships of war to disappear beneath the beauty of an ordinary morning. Yet beneath that peaceful landscape, countless families are wondering the same question they asked every single day. What will we eat tomorrow? For many households during the Civil War, the answer was hidden beneath the soil: sweet potatoes. Unlike wheat, which depended upon successful harvests, mills, transportation, and bakeries before becoming bread, sweet potatoes required remarkably little after they were pulled from the earth. They could be eaten, roasted, boiled, mashed, dried, or baked. They were filling, dependable, and surprisingly resilient. In uncertain times, those qualities made them priceless. Imagine yourself walking beside a small farmhouse somewhere in the southern countryside during the autumn of 1863. The summer heat has finally begun to fade. Golden sunlight warms the fields, where vines spread across the ground in every direction. Several members of the family kneel carefully among the rows, gently lifting the vines aside before sliding wooden forks into the loose earth. With each careful movement, thick roots emerge from the soil. Some are small enough to fit comfortably in one hand. Others are nearly the length of a forearm. Every single one brings quiet relief. Each sweet potato represents another meal, another day without hunger. Children hurry forward carrying woven baskets. They brush loose dirt from each root before placing it carefully inside. Nobody tosses them carelessly. Food has become too valuable. The harvest continues slowly throughout the afternoon. Laughter occasionally rises above the steady rhythm of work. Even during wartime, moments of joy still find room to exist. Perhaps that is one of history's greatest lessons. Hardship does not erase happiness completely. It simply teaches people to treasure smaller moments. Sweet potatoes possessed another remarkable advantage. Unlike many vegetables, they stored exceptionally well. Families often placed them inside cool root cellars, beneath barns, or in carefully prepared storage pits lined with straw. Protected from freezing temperatures and excessive moisture, they could remain edible for months. Imagine opening the heavy wooden door of a root cellar in the middle of winter. A cool, earthy smell fills the air. Shelves hold jars of preserved fruit. Bundles of dried herbs hang from ceiling beams. In one corner, baskets overflow with sweet potatoes gathered months earlier. Outside, frost covers the fields. Nothing grows now. Yet beneath this quiet shelter lies enough food to help carry a family through another season. The sweet potato asks for little. It simply waits patiently. That quiet patience made it one of the South's most dependable crops. As supplies of wheat flour became increasingly scarce, cooks searched for new ways to stretch every meal. Sweet potatoes appeared almost everywhere. They were sliced into thick rounds and baked slowly beside the fire. They were boiled until soft and mashed with whatever butter or animal fat remained available. Sometimes they were cooked directly beneath hot ashes, allowing their natural sweetness to deepen as the heat slowly softened the flesh inside. Imagine lifting one from glowing embers. Its skin has turned nearly black. A gentle stream of steam escapes as it is broken open. Inside, the bright orange flesh glows warmly in the firelight. No sugar is necessary. Nature has already provided sweetness. For children especially, such simple treats offered rare comfort during difficult years. Many families also discovered another clever use. They transformed sweet potatoes into flour. The process demanded patience. First, the potatoes were peeled and sliced into thin pieces. Then they were carefully dried, sometimes beneath the sun and sometimes near gentle heat inside the home. Once completely dry, they became surprisingly hard. These dried slices could then be ground into coarse flour. The flour rarely replaced wheat entirely. Instead, it was mixed together with whatever wheat or cornmeal remained. Bread became heavier. Biscuits tasted slightly sweeter. But valuable supplies lasted longer. Necessity encouraged remarkable creativity. Even beverages found new inspiration. As we discovered earlier in our journey, dried and roasted sweet potatoes occasionally became substitutes for coffee. Nobody believed they truly matched imported coffee beans. Still, warm cups filled cold hands each morning. Hope often arrives in surprisingly humble forms. Soldiers appreciated sweet potatoes as well. Whenever armies passed through regions where they were grown, local supplies sometimes found their way into military kitchens. Fresh vegetables were always welcome after weeks of preserved foods. Imagine a group of soldiers gather around an evening fire. instead of another meal consisting only of hardtack and salt pork. Today's supper includes roasted sweet potatoes. The smell alone lifts everyone's spirits. Someone remarks that it reminds him of home. Another quietly smiles without saying anything at all. For a few peaceful minutes, memories replace worry. Food has always carried extraordinary emotional power. One familiar taste can transport a person hundreds of miles without taking a single step. Letters written during the war occasionally mentioned sweet potatoes, with genuine affection. Some soldiers asked loved ones about the latest harvest. Others wondered whether the family garden had survived another season. These questions were not simply about vegetables. They were questions about home itself. Was the farm still standing? Had the family remained safe? Would those familiar meals still be waiting when peace finally returned? For countless people, sweet potatoes became symbols of stability in an unstable world. Even communities suffering severe shortages often managed to grow at least some. Unlike imported goods, they depended primarily upon local soil, careful hands, and favorable weather. That independence mattered enormously. Every successful harvest reduced dependence upon distant supply lines already strained by war. The sweet potato also reminded people that nature often continues its quiet work, despite human conflict. Battles may rage across nearby fields. Armies may march along dusty roads. Governments may rise and fall. Yet beneath the earth, roots continue growing patiently, almost unaware of history unfolding above them. There is something deeply comforting about that thought. Life persists, seasons continue. Spring follows winter, harvest follows planting. Even during the darkest years, the earth quietly prepares another chance. As evening settles gently across our imagined countryside, picture one final family gathered around a rough wooden table. There are no extravagant dishes waiting, no expensive desserts, no overflowing baskets of luxury. Instead, several roasted sweet potatoes rest upon simple plates. The meal is modest, but everyone has something to eat. Sometimes survival is built not upon abundance, but upon gratitude for enough. The humble sweet potato offered exactly that, enough. And while roots growing beneath the soil quietly sustained countless families, another remarkable food came not from gardens or fields, but from rivers, ponds, and hidden streams. Easy to overlook yet rich in nourishment, fish became one of the Civil War's most dependable survival foods when other supplies disappeared. The fish that quietly fed a nation at war. As another peaceful evening slowly gives way to dawn, a thin layer of mist drifts across the surface of a quiet river. The water moves almost silently, reflecting the pale colors of the awakening sky. Along the muddy banks, tall reeds sway gently with the morning breeze, while the distant call of a kingfisher echoes across the still water. If you stand here for a moment, it is difficult to imagine that an entire nation is at war. The river does not know about battle lines. It does not recognize uniforms. It continues its endless journey, just as it has for thousands of years. And for countless people during the Civil War, that quiet river became something far more valuable than a beautiful landscape. It became a source of life. When supply wagons failed to arrive, when fields had been destroyed, when livestock disappeared, the rivers continued to offer food to anyone patient enough to seek it. Unlike crops, fish did not require planting. Unlike cattle, they did not need pasture. Unlike imported goods, they ignored blockades and damaged railroads. They simply swam beneath the surface, hidden from sight. Imagine a father and his young son leaving home before sunrise. Each carries a simple fishing pole made from a long, flexible branch. Their pockets hold a few hooks, some carefully saved fishing line, and a small tin box containing worms gathered the evening before. Neither speaks very much. The quiet of early morning feels almost sacred. Reaching the riverbank, they settle beneath the shade of an old sycamore tree. The water barely ripples. A line is cast. Then comes the waiting. Fishing has always rewarded patience more than speed. Minutes pass, perhaps even an hour. The boy watches dragonflies glide above the water, while turtles slowly climb onto sunlit logs. Then suddenly, the line begins to tremble. Not violently, just enough. The father smiles gently. He nods. The boy lifts the pole carefully. Moments later, a silver fish flashes in the morning light. It is not enormous, but tonight there will be supper. Throughout the Civil War, scenes like this unfolded across both the North and the South. Thousands of rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds quietly became natural pantries. The mighty Mississippi River supported countless fishing communities. The Tennessee River, the Cumberland, the Potomac, the James, and hundreds of smaller waterways all provided valuable nourishment. For families living nearby, fish often became one of the few dependable sources of fresh protein. Different waters offered different catches. Catfish rested along muddy bottoms, moving slowly beneath fallen logs. Perch darted through clearer water. Sunfish gathered near quiet shorelines. Bass lurked patiently among submerged branches. Trout filled colder mountain streams where the water remained cool throughout the year. Every region knew its own rivers. Every fisherman learned their habits. Knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Children learned where fish gathered after heavy rain. They discovered which insects made the best bait during different seasons. They recognized how changing weather influenced the river's moods. These lessons rarely appeared in books. They were taught beside the water itself. Imagine an elderly grandfather sitting beside a shallow creek. His fishing line rests motionless upon the surface. Beside him sits his granddaughter. She asks endless questions. Why do fish hide beneath fallen trees? Why do they bite better in the evening? Why does the water rise after distant storms? Patiently, he answers each one. Without realizing it, he is passing along knowledge that may someday help her family survive. During wartime, such wisdom became extraordinarily valuable. Fishing required very few supplies. A simple hook could often be reused many times. Homemade nets sometimes stretched across narrow streams overnight. In shallow water, woven fish traps quietly waited for curious fish to swim inside. Some families even caught fish by hand beneath rocks and fallen logs, although this demanded remarkable skill and patience. Nothing was wasted. Once caught, the fish were cleaned carefully. Fresh fish might be roasted over an open fire. Others were boiled into nourishing soups. Larger catches could be salted or smoked, allowing them to last much longer. Smokehouses became familiar sights throughout rural communities. Imagine entering one on a cool autumn afternoon. Thin rays of sunlight filter through tiny gaps between weathered wooden boards. Inside hangs row after row of fish suspended from wooden poles. A slow, gentle fire burns below. The smoke curls upward, surrounding every fish with its protective warmth. The process takes days. There are no shortcuts. Slowly, moisture leaves the flesh. Smoke adds flavor while helping preserve the meat. Weeks later, those same fish may still provide valuable meals. The smokehouse quietly transforms today's success into tomorrow's security. Soldiers also turned toward rivers whenever opportunities appeared. After exhausting marches, many welcomed the chance to supplement their regular rations. Some carried small fishing lines tucked into their equipment. Others improvised with string and bent pins. Imagine a temporary camp established beside a peaceful river after several difficult days of marching. Instead of immediately sleeping, a few soldiers wander toward the water carrying simple poles. They sit quietly together. Conversation comes easily here. Someone tells stories about fishing with his father before the war. Another remembers catching enormous catfish as a boy. For a little while, they are no longer soldiers. They are simply ordinary people enjoying an ordinary afternoon. The fish they catch may be modest. The memories they awaken are priceless. Of course, rivers could never feed entire armies. Thousands of hungry soldiers required enormous quantities of food every day. Fishing served mainly as a welcome supplement rather than a complete solution. Still, every fresh meal mattered. Every fish reduced pressure upon strained supply lines. For civilians, especially those living in isolated rural areas, rivers often proved even more important. Imagine a widow caring for 3 young children. Her husband has gone to war. Money is scarce. The family garden provides vegetables. Nearby woods offer occasional berries. But the river continues giving quietly. Several evenings each week she walks to its banks carrying a small basket. Sometimes she returns with only 1 fish. Sometimes with several. Each catch helps stretch precious supplies just a little farther. History often celebrates dramatic victories. Yet survival usually depends upon smaller, quieter triumphs. 1 successful afternoon of fishing. 1 carefully preserved meal. 1 family making it through another week. Nature itself became an unexpected ally during the Civil War. Forests offered wild plants. Fields produced roots. Streams carried fish. Together, they reminded people that even when human systems failed, the natural world still held remarkable generosity for those willing to understand it. As twilight slowly settles over the gentle river, picture its surface becoming perfectly still once more. The day's last fisherman gathers his equipment. A small basket rests beside him. Inside are enough fish for tomorrow's breakfast. He looks across the quiet water one final time before beginning the walk home. Behind him, the river continues flowing, patient, steady, unchanged. It has carried life through countless generations, asking nothing in return except patience and respect. And while rivers quietly nourish those fortunate enough to live nearby, the forests surrounding them held another remarkable collection of survival foods. Hidden among trees, bushes, and winding woodland paths grew berries, nuts, greens, and edible plants that became nature's secret pantry during the long years of war. The wild foods that helped families survive. The morning begins with the gentle rustling of leaves high above the forest floor. A cool breeze slips quietly between towering oak, hickory, and pine trees, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp moss and fallen leaves. Sunlight filters through the branches in soft, golden beams, touching patches of wild flowers that bloom unnoticed beneath the great canopy. At first glance, the forest appears untouched by war. Birds continue building their nests. Squirrels race along the branches. A deer pauses to drink from a quiet stream before disappearing once more into the trees. Nature moves at its own peaceful rhythm. Yet beneath this calm beauty, the forest has quietly become something far more important. For countless families during the Civil War, it became a grocery store without walls. When fields failed to produce enough food, when markets stood nearly empty, when wagons carrying supplies never arrived, people turned towards the woods, not because they wanted to, because they had to. Imagine a mother and her 2 children leaving their farmhouse shortly after sunrise. Each carries a woven basket. The youngest child skips ahead with excitement, while the older one walks beside their mother, already learning how to recognize the difference between helpful plants and dangerous ones. This knowledge cannot be rushed. It has been passed carefully from one generation to another for centuries. A single mistake could bring serious illness. A careful eye could provide supper. The forest rewards patience, not haste. Their first stop is a patch of blackberry bushes growing along the edge of an old fence line. The berries glisten in the early morning sunlight. Some are still bright red. Those are left untouched. Others have ripened into deep shades of purple-black. These are ready. Tiny hands gently pluck each berry, placing it carefully into the basket. Occasionally, one disappears into a smiling mouth. No one objects. Even during difficult times, simple pleasures still matter. Blackberries were among the most dependable wild fruits available throughout much of the country. They grew abundantly with very little care. Wild raspberries often appeared nearby. In wooded clearings, strawberries covered sunny patches of ground each spring. Later in the season came elderberries, grapes, and persimmons. Each fruit arrived according to nature's calendar. Families learned to recognize these quiet rhythms. They knew exactly when certain berries would appear. They understood which hillsides ripened first. They remembered where the sweetest patches grew. This was not simply gathering food, it was reading the landscape like an old friend. Imagine an elderly woman walking confidently through the woods without hesitation. To an outsider, every tree looks the same. To her, every bend in the trail tells a story. She knows where hickory nuts will soon fall. She remembers an old persimmon tree hidden beyond a rocky stream. She can almost predict where mushrooms may appear after several days of gentle rain. Years of observation have become wisdom, and during wartime, wisdom could fill empty stomachs. Nuts became another precious gift from the forest. Hickory nuts, black walnuts, beech nuts, chestnuts, where disease had not yet destroyed the great American chestnut forests. Gathering them required effort. The shells were often thick and stubborn, but inside waited rich nourishment, healthy fats, protein, calories that helped sustain people through long winters. Children often became expert nut gatherers. Imagine them laughing beneath enormous trees on a cool autumn afternoon. Every gust of wind sends fresh nuts tumbling onto the leaves below. The race begins. Who can fill a basket first? Who can find the largest walnut? For the children, it feels almost like a game. For their parents, each full basket represents another valuable food supply for the months ahead. The forest also offered leafy greens, wild dandelion leaves, lamb's quarters, plantain, pokeweed. though only its very young shoots could be safely prepared with careful repeated boiling, and older parts of the plant could be poisonous. Knowledge mattered here more than courage. Families never gathered unfamiliar plants simply because they looked edible. They relied upon experience. Mistakes carried serious consequences. Many rural families possessed knowledge that had been preserved for generations. Some learned from indigenous communities whose understanding of native plants stretched back centuries. Others inherited traditions from European settlers who gradually adapted their old world knowledge to American forests. Together, these traditions created remarkable survival skills. Imagine preparing a simple spring meal. Fresh wild greens simmer gently inside a cast iron pot. A small piece of salt pork adds flavor. Perhaps a little cornmeal accompanies the meal. It is modest. Yet after months of preserved foods, those fresh greens bring welcome, color, and nourishment. Sometimes the greatest luxury is simply freshness. Medicinal herbs often grew beside edible plants. While searching for food, people also gathered mint, yarrow, chamomile, and other useful herbs. These were dried carefully and stored for later use. During wartime, every useful plant held value. Nothing was gathered carelessly. Nothing was wasted. The forest demanded respect. Imagine walking quietly through those woods at dusk. The day's warmth slowly fades, birdsong softens. A gentle breeze stirs the branches overhead. You carry a basket that now holds blackberries, walnuts, wild onions, and a handful of tender greens. It is not overflowing, but it is enough. Enough for tonight. Enough to help tomorrow arrive. Soldiers occasionally became foragers as well. When supplies grew scarce, they searched nearby woods for edible berries, nuts, and plants. Experienced outdoorsmen often guided their companions. Others learned through careful observation. One veteran later recalled the surprising satisfaction of discovering wild grapes after several difficult days of marching. They were not part of any official ration, yet they tasted sweeter than almost any feast. Hunger has a remarkable ability to transform simple foods into unforgettable memories. Nature asks nothing in return except patience. The Civil War repeatedly revealed this quiet truth. While human supply lines collapsed, while prices climbed beyond imagination, while markets emptied, the forest continued offering small gifts to those who understood where to look. Not unlimited gifts, not effortless gifts, but enough. Enough to remind people that survival often depends less upon abundance than upon awareness. Every berry, every nut, every edible leaf, each one represented another quiet victory over hardship. As darkness gently settles across the woodland, imagine one final family returning home along a narrow path. Their baskets are heavier than when they left. The children speak excitedly about tomorrow's adventure. Their mother smiles quietly. She knows these woods have once again provided exactly what was needed. Behind them, the forest grows silent beneath the evening sky. It keeps its ancient secrets, waiting patiently for those willing to learn them. And while the forest generously offered berries, nuts, and wild greens, another humble crop growing in carefully tended gardens became the true backbone of countless Civil War kitchens. Simple, nourishing, and endlessly versatile, beans quietly earned a reputation as one of the greatest survival foods of the entire conflict. Why beans became the ultimate Civil War. Survival food. The evening settles gently across the countryside. One by one, the sounds of the day begin to fade. Birds disappear into the branches above. Horses grow quiet in their stables. And thin ribbons of smoke rise lazily from chimneys into the cool night air. Inside small homes and military camps alike, tiny cooking fires flicker with a warm orange glow. Above many of those fires hangs a simple black iron pot. Nothing about it seems extraordinary. Its surface is darkened by years of smoke. The handle is worn smooth from countless hands. It has prepared thousands of meals, yet no one would mistake it for something valuable. And still, during the Civil War, what simmered inside that humble pot often meant the difference between strength and exhaustion. More often than not, it was beans. Beans have accompanied human history for thousands of years. Long before modern agriculture transformed the world, people understood that these small seeds possessed remarkable qualities. They were nutritious, inexpensive, easy to dry, and capable of remaining edible for astonishing lengths of time. For families living through war, those qualities became priceless. Imagine opening a cloth sack filled with dried beans. They make a soft, rattling sound as they tumble into a wooden bowl. Unlike fresh vegetables that spoil within days, these beans have waited patiently for months. Perhaps they were harvested during the previous autumn, perhaps even earlier. Time has changed them very little. They remain ready. All they require is water, fire, and patience. That patience became an important ingredient. Before cooking, beans were usually soaked for several hours, sometimes overnight. As they rested in cool water, they slowly awakened. They absorbed moisture, little by little. The hard seeds softened. By morning, they were ready for the cooking pot. Imagine the quiet rhythm of a farmhouse kitchen before sunrise. The fire has just been lit. A kettle begins to warm. The beans that soaked overnight are gently poured into a heavy iron pot. Fresh water covers them once again. If the family is fortunate, a small piece of salt pork is added for flavor. Perhaps a chopped onion from the garden. Maybe a few herbs hanging from the kitchen ceiling. Nothing complicated, nothing extravagant. The pot is placed over a slow fire. Then everyone goes about the day's work. Beans ask for very little attention. They simply simmer, hour after hour, slowly becoming softer, slowly filling the room with a comforting aroma. By evening, supper is ready. One pot has fed an entire family. This quiet efficiency made beans one of the greatest survival foods of the Civil War. For soldiers, they became almost as familiar as hardtack. Union camps especially received dried beans as a regular part of military rations whenever supply lines allowed. They traveled well. They weighed relatively little. Most importantly, they provided valuable nutrition after long days of marching. Of course, soldiers found endless reasons to joke about them. Letters sent home often mentioned another supper of beans. Diaries occasionally recorded several consecutive days in which beans appeared at nearly every meal. The repetition became tiresome. Yet few questioned their importance. Beans kept people alive. Imagine a group of soldiers gathering around a large cooking kettle as darkness settles across the camp. Someone lifts the heavy lid. A cloud of fragrant steam rises into the evening air. The beans have cooked for hours. A few small pieces of pork float near the surface. Each soldier steps forward with a tin cup or plate. Nobody receives very much. Supplies must last. Still, the meal is hot. After a cold day, that alone brings comfort. The conversations begin almost immediately. One man talks about his family's farm. Another wonders whether his wife has harvested the garden yet. Someone else remembers his mother's bean soup that seemed to taste better than anything he has eaten since leaving home. The food itself becomes a bridge, connecting the campfire with distant kitchens hundreds of miles away. That bridge matters more than anyone says aloud. Food carries memory. Even the simplest meal can transport a tired mind back to peaceful days before war. Beans offered another remarkable advantage. They improved the soil itself. Farmers had long observed that crops like beans and peas helped restore fertility to fields that had grown tired after repeated harvests. Although the science behind this process would become better understood later, practical experience had already taught generations of farmers the value of rotating such crops. A bean harvest provided food today while quietly helping tomorrow's crops grow stronger. Nature often rewards patience in unexpected ways. Gardens became increasingly important as the war continued. Behind countless homes, rows of beans climbed wooden poles or spread across carefully tended earth. Children were often given the responsibility of helping with these gardens. Imagine a little girl carrying a small watering bucket, almost as large as herself. She moves carefully between the rows, trying not to step on the young plants. Her father is away serving in the army. Her mother manages the household. Every bean that grows feels important. Every harvest becomes a quiet celebration. When the pods mature, the family gathers them together. Some beans are eaten fresh. Many more are left to dry completely. The dried beans are shelled by hand during long winter evenings. Family members sit together near the fireplace. Hands remain busy while stories fill the room. Outside, snow covers the fields. Inside it, tomorrow's meals quietly accumulate in cloth sacks. This peaceful work continues night after night. The war feels far away for a little while. There were many different kinds of beans. White navy beans became especially common because they cooked well and stored beautifully. Lima beans appeared in some regions. Kidney beans, black-eyed peas, and other local varieties filled gardens according to climate and tradition. Each community adapted to what grew best. Recipes varied from household to household. Some families preferred thick bean stews, others cooked lighter soups. Some baked beans slowly inside brick ovens until they became wonderfully tender. Every kitchen developed its own traditions. Even when ingredients changed, the humble bean remained at the heart of the meal. Beans also taught an important lesson about abundance. One handful of dried beans looked surprisingly small. Yet after soaking and cooking, that same handful expanded dramatically. A modest supply suddenly fed far more people than expected. For families facing shortages, this simple transformation felt almost miraculous. Imagine watching the pot throughout the day. The water gently bubbles. The beans swell little by little. By evening, what seemed insufficient in the morning has become enough for everyone gathered around the table. Sometimes hope grows quietly, just like that. Little by little, without drawing attention to itself, as another peaceful night settles over our journey through history. Picture one final iron bean pot resting beside glowing coals. The fire burns low now. The last bowls have been served. Children grow sleepy. Adults speak softly about tomorrow's work. Outside, uncertainty still surrounds the nation. Inside, the simple meal has done exactly what it needed to do. It has nourished both body and spirit. The pot will be washed in the morning. Soon it will hang above the fire once again, patiently waiting to prepare another humble meal. And while beans quietly filled countless homes and camps with warmth, another surprising ingredient found its way into Civil War kitchens when ordinary flour became difficult to obtain. It was made from a crop already growing in many fields, and with a little ingenuity, it became one of the war's most unexpected substitutes for bread, the golden grain that replaced bread in hard times. The first hints of dawn arrive quietly over the countryside. A blanket of pale mist stretches across the fields, softening every fence, every tree, and every distant farmhouse. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster announces the coming morning, while the gentle creaking of a windmill blends with the whisper of leaves moving in the cool breeze. Inside a small wooden home, someone is already awake. A fire glows softly inside a cast iron stove. Its warmth slowly fills the kitchen as another uncertain day begins. There is no fresh loaf of wheat bread cooling on the windowsill. No basket of white rolls waiting beside the table. Instead, a cloth sack rests near the fireplace. It contains something far humbler: cornmeal. Today it may seem difficult to imagine a time when bread itself became a luxury. For many people during the Civil War, especially across the South, wheat flour grew increasingly scarce. Flour mills were damaged or abandoned. Transportation routes became dangerous. Harvests were interrupted as fields became battlefields, and countless farmers left home to join the armies. Yet corn continued to grow across much of the countryside. It had been part of American life long before the first European settlers arrived. Indigenous communities had cultivated maize for centuries, developing countless ways to prepare and preserve it. Their knowledge shaped the diets of generations that followed. Now, during wartime, corn once again proved its remarkable value. Imagine standing beside a field in late summer. Tall stalks stretch toward the bright blue sky, their broad green leaves rustling gently in the afternoon breeze. Golden ears hide beneath layers of pale green husks. The harvest has arrived. Entire families gather together. Children pull back the husks with eager hands. Parents stack the heavy ears into growing piles. Grandparents smile quietly, knowing another winter may now be a little easier. Each basket represents security. Once harvested, the corn is carefully dried. Some ears are hung from rafters inside barns. Others are spread across peepee platforms where fresh air circulates freely. Weeks pass. The kernels harden until they become almost as solid as tiny stones. Now they are ready. Not to be eaten immediately, but to become something far more useful: cornmeal. Imagine the slow turning of a wooden mill wheel beside a clear stream. Water flows steadily beneath it, powering great wooden gears hidden inside the mill. With each gentle rotation, dried corn kernels are crushed between enormous millstones. The steady grinding creates a warm, comforting sound. Slowly, golden meal begins to pour into waiting sacks. Its texture is slightly coarse. Its color glows softly in the afternoon light. The smell is fresh and earthy, simple, honest. This humble meal would feed countless families. Back home, the possibilities seemed almost endless. Cornmeal could become thick porridge served warm on cold mornings. It could be shaped into small cakes and baked beside the fire. It could become Johnny cakes, hoe cakes, ash cakes, or simple cornbread. Each region developed its own favorite methods. Each family added small touches passed down through generations. Imagine a grandmother stirring cornmeal into boiling water inside a heavy iron pot. The mixture thickens slowly. She continues stirring patiently with a long wooden spoon. Soon it reaches the perfect consistency. She pours it into a shallow dish to cool. Later, slices may be fried until crisp around the edges. Nothing complicated, nothing expensive. Just nourishment. Cornbread became perhaps the most beloved of all these creations. Unlike wheat bread, it required no yeast. There was no need to wait for dough to rise. A simple mixture of cornmeal, water, and perhaps a little salt could quickly become a warm loaf. If buttermilk or eggs happened to be available, the bread became richer. If not, families made do without them. The result was denser than wheat bread. Its texture crumbled easily. Its flavor carried a gentle sweetness born naturally from the corn itself. Fresh from the oven, it filled humble kitchens with an aroma that many Civil War veterans later remembered for the rest of their lives. Food has an extraordinary ability to preserve memories. One familiar smell can carry a person across decades in an instant. A soldier sitting beside a distant campfire might catch the scent of cornmeal cooking. Suddenly, he is no longer surrounded by tents and marching columns. Instead, he is back home. His mother is lifting warm cornbread from the oven. His younger brothers are setting the table. Outside, the evening sun settles quietly beyond familiar fields. For a brief moment, home feels wonderfully close. Cornmeal also traveled well. Army cooks appreciated that. Large sacks could be loaded onto wagons and carried for many miles. Unlike fresh bread, cornmeal spoiled slowly if kept dry. Whenever supplies allowed, military kitchens prepared simple cornmeal mush or baked rough cakes over open fires. Imagine several soldiers gathered around glowing embers after sunset. One mixes cornmeal with water inside a battered tin bowl. Another places a flat iron pan near the fire. Soon small cakes begin to brown gently. The smell drifts through the camp. Hungry faces brighten. It may not be a feast, but warm food has a remarkable way of lifting weary spirits. Families became wonderfully inventive with every handful of cornmeal. Some stirred wild berries into the batter during summer. Others mixed in chopped onions or herbs from the garden. A little rendered pork fat added richness whenever it could be spared. Each variation reflected whatever nature and circumstance provided. The meal changed with the seasons. Spring brought tender greens. Summer offered fresh vegetables. Autumn added pumpkins and squash. Winter relied upon preserved foods stored with careful planning. Through every season, cornmeal remained dependable. There was another reason it became so important. Very little was wasted. Even broken kernels could be ground. Corn husks found new life as mattress stuffing or woven crafts. The cobs themselves served as fuel for cooking fires once completely dried. Every part found a purpose. The Civil War repeatedly demonstrated that survival often depends upon respecting every available resource. Nothing should be overlooked. Imagine one final evening inside a quiet farmhouse. Rain taps softly against the roof. The fire glows warmly beneath an old black kettle. On the table rests a simple loaf of fresh cornbread. Its golden crust catches the flickering light from the fireplace. A father carefully slices it into equal portions. No piece is larger than another. Everyone receives enough. The meal is modest, yet no one leaves the table hungry. Sometimes history's greatest comforts arrive in the simplest forms. A warm slice of cornbread, a peaceful evening, a family gathered together despite the uncertainty beyond their door. Cornmeal quietly made such moments possible. And while corn became the dependable grain that replaced wheat in countless homes, another surprisingly sweet ingredient nearly vanished altogether. As sugar grew scarce, families began searching for remarkable new ways to satisfy a longing that had once seemed so ordinary. The unexpected Civil War. Foods that replaced a precious luxury. The evening settles gently over the countryside. The last golden rays of sunlight slip behind distant hills, leaving the sky painted in soft shades of amber and violet. One by one, the sounds of the day begin to fade. Horses return to their barns, chickens settle onto their roosts, and somewhere beyond the trees, a whip-poor-will begins its familiar evening song. Inside a modest farmhouse, supper is nearly ended. The plates are almost empty. The children linger at the table hoping for one small treat before bedtime. Before the war, perhaps, there would have been a slice of pie, spoonful of preserves, or a warm biscuit sprinkled with sugar. Now, the small wooden sugar bowl sits nearly empty. Its bottom can be seen through the few remaining crystals. No one reaches for it. Everyone understands it must last a little longer. The Civil War changed countless everyday habits, but few changes were felt as deeply as the disappearance of sugar. It may seem surprising today. Modern grocery stores display entire shelves filled with sugar in every imaginable form. White sugar, brown sugar, powdered sugar, raw sugar. There is rarely a shortage. For 19th century Americans, especially those living in the South, the story became very different. Much of the refined sugar people purchased traveled through long and complicated trade routes. During the war, ports were blockaded, railroads were damaged, and transportation became increasingly unreliable. Even when sugar could still be found, its price climbed beyond the reach of many ordinary families. A simple spoonful became a luxury. Imagine walking into a village store in 1864. The shopkeeper greets each customer warmly, but his shelves are noticeably bare. There is a small barrel that once overflowed with sugar. Now only a thin layer remains at the bottom. A woman quietly asks how much it costs. The shopkeeper hesitates before answering. The price has doubled, then tripled. Finally, it has become more expensive than she can possibly afford. She smiles politely. She thanks him. Then she leaves without buying any. Outside, she begins thinking about what might replace it. Human beings have always searched for sweetness, not because it is necessary for survival, but because it offers comfort. A sweet taste reminds us of celebration, of birthdays, of holidays, of peaceful days before hardship arrived. People were unwilling to surrender that comfort entirely. Instead, they began looking toward nature. One of the most dependable substitutes came from sorghum. Across many southern farms, tall stalks of sorghum waved gently in the summer breeze. At first glance, they resembled corn. Yet hidden inside their thick stems was sweet juice waiting to be discovered. Harvesting sorghum required patience. The stalks were cut carefully before being fed through heavy rollers. As the rollers turned, pale green juice flowed into waiting buckets. The fresh liquid looked almost ordinary. Its transformation had only begun. Imagine standing beside a large iron kettle set above an open fire. Fresh sorghum juice slowly pours inside. The fire burns gently beneath it. Hour after hour, the liquid simmers. Steam rises into the cool autumn air. The water gradually evaporates. The juice becomes darker, thicker, richer. By evening, what began as thin green liquid has become deep golden syrup. Warm, smooth, sweet. Families poured it over cornbread, mixed it into porridge, used it while baking whenever flour and eggs could be spared. Children sometimes received a single spoonful as a treasured treat. It was not refined white sugar. It did not need to be. It carried its own quiet character. Another source of sweetness waited high among the trees. Honey. Long before European settlers arrived in North America, honey had already been treasured around the world for thousands of years. Beekeeping continued during the Civil War whenever circumstances allowed. Imagine a small wooden hive standing quietly beside a garden. Bees move steadily from flower to flower throughout the spring and summer, paying no attention to the conflict unfolding beyond the fields. They continue gathering nectar. They continue building honeycomb. They continue producing honey exactly as they always have. Nature refuses to hurry. When autumn arrives, careful beekeepers collect only part of the honey. Enough is always left behind so the bees themselves can survive the winter. The harvested honey becomes precious, a little stirred into tea, a little spread upon warm cornbread, a little saved for someone who has fallen ill. Every drop is appreciated. Wild honey also tempted adventurous foragers. Finding it was another matter entirely. Imagine walking quietly through an old forest. A faint humming catches your attention. At first, it seems almost impossible to locate. Then you notice dozens of bees disappearing into a hollow oak tree. Somewhere inside lies a hidden hive. Gathering wild honey demanded courage, patience, and more than a few bee stings. Yet many believed the reward was worth every effort. Maple syrup offered sweetness in northern regions. Each spring, as freezing nights gave way to warmer days, maple trees quietly awakened. Small holes were carefully drilled into their trunks. Clear sap dripped slowly into waiting buckets. Bucket after bucket was collected. Then, just as with sorghum, the sap was boiled for hours. Most of the water disappeared into the air. What remained was rich maple syrup. The process demanded enormous amounts of sap, yet families willingly devoted the time. Sweetness had become too valuable to ignore. Even fruits played an important role. Apples, peaches, blackberries, persimmons. When fully ripened, they offered natural sweetness that required no added sugar. Some fruits were dried beneath the warm summer sun. Others became preserves whenever enough sweetener could be found. Imagine rows of sliced apples resting on wooden drying racks. Warm breezes pass gently across them day after day. Slowly, the fruit shrinks. Its sweetness becomes concentrated. Months later, those dried slices still provide comforting flavor during the cold winter months. Nothing is wasted, not even the peels. Apple peels sometimes flavored vinegar. Fruit scraps occasionally fed livestock. Seeds were carefully saved for future planting. Every harvest became an investment in tomorrow. Children adapted remarkably well to these changing tastes. At first, they missed candy and sugary desserts. Soon, however, roasted sweet potatoes, dried apples, sorghum syrup, and honey became special treats in their own right. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to redefine what feels normal. What once seemed like a substitute gradually became tradition. Many of these foods remained beloved long after peace returned. Even today, warm biscuits with sorghum syrup continue to appear on tables throughout parts of the American South. Their origins quietly trace back to years when necessity encouraged remarkable ingenuity. Imagine one final evening beside a glowing fireplace. Outside, rain taps softly upon the roof. Inside, a grandmother slices fresh cornbread while a small jar of dark sorghum syrup rests nearby. She pours only a little onto each piece, just enough. The children smile as though they have received a feast. Perhaps in that moment they truly have. Not because the meal is extravagant, but because it is shared. Comfort has never depended entirely upon abundance. Sometimes it lives inside the smallest acts of kindness. A warm loaf, a spoonful of syrup, a family gathered safely together. As the fire slowly burns lower and another peaceful day comes to an end, we leave this quiet kitchen behind. Yet our journey through the Civil War's strangest survival foods is far from over. Ahead lies another remarkable chapter where desperation led people to transform ingredients, once considered fit only for animals, into meals that sustained human lives. The unbelievable foods people learned to eat. The night has quietly passed, and another gentle morning begins to unfold across the countryside. Thin ribbons of fog drift lazily through the valleys, softening the outlines of distant barns and quiet farmhouses. The cool air carries the scent of damp earth after a light rain, while somewhere nearby a mourning dove offers its calm, familiar call. For a few peaceful moments the land seems untouched by hardship. Yet inside many homes, another difficult question quietly waits. What can still be eaten? As the Civil War stretched from one season into the next, people slowly discovered that survival often meant changing the very definition of food. During peaceful years, certain crops were grown almost entirely for livestock. Some plants were considered too coarse, too bitter, or simply too ordinary for the family table. Others were used only during emergencies. War has a remarkable way of transforming emergencies into everyday life. Imagine a farmer standing beside his nearly empty grain storage. Only a few sacks remain. He studies them carefully. Some contain grain that had originally been intended for his horses. Another sack holds feed that would normally never appear in a family kitchen. He pauses for a long moment. The animals need food. His children need food too. There is no easy answer. Across the divided nation, thousands of families faced similar decisions. Whenever possible, they avoided using livestock feed for themselves. But when every other option disappeared, people became extraordinarily resourceful. One grain that quietly crossed this boundary was oats. Today we often associate oats with breakfast cereal or oatmeal, but during the 19th century large quantities were grown specifically to feed horses. As shortages worsened, more families began preparing oats for their own meals. Imagine an iron pot gently simmering above a small fire. Inside, whole oats slowly soften in hot water. The process takes patience. Little by little, the grains become tender. A small spoonful of honey, if any can be spared, transforms the simple porridge into something surprisingly comforting. Warm, filling, gentle for many children, it became one of the few dependable breakfasts available. Another humble grain quietly entered more kitchens: rye. Although rye bread had long been familiar in some regions, people increasingly mixed rye flour with whatever cornmeal or wheat remained. Pure white bread became uncommon. Instead, darker loaves appeared on countless tables. Their texture was heavier. Their flavor carried a pleasant earthiness. No one complained. Bread of any kind had become a blessing. Imagine a village baker opening his oven. Instead of rows of soft white loaves, he removed sturdy dark bread made from a mixture of rye, corn, and whatever flour could still be found. The appearance has changed. The purpose has not. It still feeds hungry families. Sometimes that is all food needs to do. The Civil War also encouraged people to rediscover plants that earlier generations had valued, but that later became less common. Chestnut flour, where available, occasionally supplemented ordinary flour. Ground acorns, after careful preparation to remove their bitterness, sometimes stretched precious grain supplies. Even dried peas found new purpose. Ground into coarse meal, they thickened soups and stews while adding valuable nourishment. Imagine a grandmother carefully grinding dried peas with a hand mill. The work is slow. The handle turns steadily. Small clouds of fine powder gather beneath the stones. She smiles quietly. Tomorrow's soup will be a little heartier. Every small improvement matters. Not all experiments succeeded. Some recipes were quickly forgotten because they simply tasted unpleasant. Others demanded so much effort that few families repeated them unless absolutely necessary. Yet even failed attempts taught valuable lessons. Each experiment represented hope. Hope that another meal could be created from almost nothing. Letters from the Civil War occasionally mention these unusual substitutions with surprising honesty. One soldier joked that he was no longer certain exactly what he had eaten. Another wrote home describing bread made from unfamiliar mixtures of grain. Their words carried humor, but beneath the laughter lay quiet resilience. People adapted because they refused to surrender. Imagine several neighbors gathering after church on a Sunday afternoon. Instead of discussing grand political events, they exchange recipes. One family has discovered that adding a handful of mashed beans improves coarse bread. Another recommends drying pumpkins before grinding them into baking mixtures. Someone else shares a better way to roast oats. Knowledge spreads quietly. Not through newspapers, not through official instruction, but from neighbor to neighbor. Conversation becomes survival. One of the most remarkable qualities of these wartime kitchens was their willingness to experiment without certainty. Modern recipes often provide exact measurements. 1 cup, 2 teaspoons, bake for 40 minutes. Civil War cooks rarely enjoyed such precision. Ingredients changed constantly. A little more cornmeal, a little less flour. No eggs today. Perhaps only water instead of milk. Every meal became an act of careful judgment. Imagine standing beside a woman preparing bread. She does not measure with metal cups. She uses experience. A handful here, a pinch there. She feels the dough with her fingertips. She knows when it is ready not because of written instructions, but because she has prepared similar meals hundreds of times before. That quiet knowledge cannot easily be written into books. It lives inside practice. Children grew up watching these skills. Many later carried them into their own homes. In this way, hardship quietly shaped an entire generation's understanding of food. Waste became almost impossible to imagine. Even stale bread received new life. Dry crusts became crumbs. Crumbs thickened soups. Broken pieces were softened with milk or broth whenever either could be found. Nothing ended its journey after one meal. Everything found another purpose. This careful attitude extended far beyond the kitchen. Vegetable scraps became compost. Animal scraps fed livestock. Ashes from cooking fires sometimes enriched gardens. Every resource remained part of an ongoing cycle. The Civil War repeatedly demonstrated that survival depends not only upon what people possess, but also upon how wisely they use it. Imagine one final evening inside a quiet farmhouse. The day's work has ended. A loaf made from oats, rye, cornmeal, and a small amount of wheat flour rests upon the table. Its appearance is plain. Its crust is rough. Its shape is imperfect. Yet when it is sliced, warm steam rises gently into the cool evening air. Everyone receives a piece. No one asks whether it resembles the bread of earlier years. They are simply grateful that there is bread at all. Sometimes gratitude transforms ordinary food into something extraordinary. As darkness settles gently beyond the windows, the family quietly shares another simple meal together. Outside, the uncertainty of war continues. Inside, the warmth of the hearth remains. And while people learn to create nourishing meals from grains once overlooked, another remarkable survival food came from an animal so common that few gave it much thought before the war. It was inexpensive, easy to raise, and capable of feeding entire families, even when larger livestock had disappeared. What the strangest survival meals of the Civil War still teach us today. Our long journey is finally drawing to a quiet close. Imagine one last evening, settling gently across the American countryside. The sun slips below the horizon, leaving behind a sky painted in soft shades of gold, lavender, and deep blue. The warm light fades slowly from the fields, while the first stars begin appearing one by one above the peaceful landscape. The guns have fallen silent. The marching columns have disappeared. The smoke that once drifted above battlefields has long since faded into history. Only the land remains. The rivers still flow as they always have. The forests continue growing. The fields wait patiently for another spring. If someone were to walk through this countryside today, they might never guess how many ordinary people once struggled here, simply to find enough food for another day. History often remembers wars through battles. But wars are also remembered through kitchens, through gardens, through empty cupboards, through the quiet determination of people who refuse to let their families go hungry. Throughout our journey, we have met remarkable foods that most people today would never expect to become symbols of survival. We shared a morning cup that contained no coffee at all, yet still brought comfort to weary families. We held a piece of hardtack so strong that soldiers joked it could outlast the war itself. We opened barrels filled with heavily salted pork that crossed hundreds of miles without spoiling. We walked through fields where sweet potatoes quietly waited beneath the soil. We followed rivers that continued feeding communities when supply wagons failed. We wandered into forests where berries, nuts, and wild greens became precious gifts. We listened to the gentle bubbling of bean pots that never seemed to stop simmering. We watched golden corn become bread when wheat disappeared. We discovered sweetness hidden inside sorghum, maple trees, and honey after sugar became scarce. We even saw families transform overlooked grains and forgotten ingredients into nourishing meals that earlier generations might never have considered. None of these foods were glamorous. Very few appeared on elegant dining tables. Most were born from necessity rather than choice. Yet together, they tell one extraordinary story. The story of adaptation. Human history is filled with remarkable inventions. Great ships crossed oceans. Railroads connected continents. Telegraphs carried messages faster than ever before. Yet perhaps humanity's greatest invention has always been something much quieter. The ability to adapt. Whenever circumstances change, people learn. Whenever resources disappear, new ideas emerge. Whenever hardship arrives, ordinary individuals discover extraordinary resilience within themselves. The Civil War offers countless examples of this timeless truth. Imagine a young child helping gather blackberries in the summer of 1864. At the time, it may have seemed like nothing more than an afternoon spent with family. Yet decades later, that same child, now an elderly grandparent, might tell the story to grandchildren gathered around another fireplace. We survived because we learned to use everything. Those simple words carry enormous wisdom. Survival rarely depends upon abundance. More often, it depends upon appreciation. The Civil War also reminds us that food is never only about nutrition. Meals carry memories. The smell of fresh cornbread reminds someone of home. A warm bowl of beans recalls evenings spent around a family table. The sweetness of sorghum syrup brings back childhood mornings long before the world changed. Even hardtack, despite all the jokes soldiers made about it, eventually became something veterans remembered with surprising affection. Not because it tasted wonderful, but because it reminded them of the people who shared those difficult years beside them. Food preserves stories. Long after recipes fade, memories remain. Modern life often surrounds us with extraordinary abundance. Fresh fruit arrives from distant countries in every season. Bread appears in countless varieties. Coffee comes from every corner of the world. Supermarkets overflow with choices that would have seemed almost unimaginable to Civil War families. That abundance is easy to take for granted. The people we have met throughout this journey gently encourage us to pause, to notice, to appreciate. A simple loaf of bread, clean drinking water, fresh vegetables, a warm meal shared with loved ones. These ordinary blessings are in many ways extraordinary. The forests still offer berries. The rivers still hold fish. Gardens still reward careful hands. Nature continues providing quietly, just as it did more than a century and a half ago. The relationship between people and the land has never truly disappeared. It has simply become easier to overlook. Imagine one final farmhouse standing peacefully beneath an enormous oak tree. The war has ended. The fences have been repaired. Children once again laugh while chasing one another across the yard. Inside the kitchen, supper is almost ready. There is fresh bread cooling upon the table. A pot of beans still simmers gently over the fire. Sweet potatoes roast nearby. Someone pours a little honey onto warm cornbread. Not because sugar is unavailable, simply because the family has grown to love its familiar taste. Some wartime habits quietly remain. Not every lesson learned through hardship disappears when peace returns. Many recipes born during the Civil War continued passing from one generation to the next. Some survive even today. People may no longer remember exactly why certain dishes first became popular. Yet hidden within every recipe lives a fragment of history, a reminder of resilience, a reminder of creativity, a reminder that ordinary people accomplished extraordinary things without seeking recognition. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson these strange survival foods leave behind. History is not built only by famous names carved into monuments. It is also built by mothers stretching one sack of cornmeal through another week, by fathers rising before sunrise to fish quiet rivers, by children gathering berries beneath summer skies, by grandparents saving seeds for next year's garden, by neighbors sharing recipes instead of keeping them secret, by strangers offering one warm meal to someone who has none. These quiet acts rarely appear in history books, yet they shaped history just the same. As our evening together slowly comes to an end, the fire before us burns lower. The crackling wood grows softer. Outside, the night air becomes cool and peaceful. The stars shine brightly above a landscape that has witnessed sorrow, courage, hardship, and hope. Somewhere in darkness, an owl calls gently from the forest. The river continues flowing beyond the trees. Tomorrow morning the sun will rise, once again over fields that have known both war and peace. Life continues. It always has. And perhaps, before we leave this quiet place behind, we can carry one final thought with us. The strangest survival foods of the Civil War were never truly about strange food. They were about remarkable people. People who refused to surrender to hunger. People who found hope in the smallest harvest. People who transformed scarcity into ingenuity. People who discovered that courage sometimes looks less like charging across a battlefield and more like quietly placing another simple meal on the family table. In the end, those humble meals nourished far more than empty stomachs. They nourished perseverance. They nourished community. They nourished hope itself. And even now, more than 160 years later, their quiet story continues to remind us that the greatest strength often reveals itself not in moments of triumph, but in the gentle determination to care for one another. One meal at a time. Thank you for taking this peaceful journey through history. May the stories of these ordinary people and the extraordinary foods that helped them endure remain with you long after the fire has faded and the night has grown still.